Good evening, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog on the Synagogue News. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. Had a little bit of an issue yesterday with not quite registering everything over here, right? It wasn't telling me that it was going live, and it actually was live. So if anybody's currently seeing this at the moment, please do just drop me a quick thumbs up. I'm going to continue forward as if this is live because I have no reason to assume it's not. But just for clarification, do always want to get some audience participation. So if anyone's currently watching, please do give me a brief thumbs up there or something along those lines to let me know that we are, in fact, live at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and stall for time for a moment while we try to get other people over here. So if you are currently here, please remember to like and share this video. Please remember to get this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? If you like this content, please consider hitting that subscribe button so that you can get notified of every time that we actually do go live. Actually, you'll have to hit the bell to get notified of every time we go live, but if you subscribe, of course, you'll at least get this in your feed, and that'll get you at least somewhat of a link to us, right? So that'll definitely be pretty cool. If you are also trying to help out with actually contributing to fighting against the big tech overlords, as I like to call them, or really just the overlords in general, they don't have to be specific to big tech, right? They all work with each other. But nonetheless, one of the ways you can do that is by going over to Gab, Parler, or Minds and getting one of those accounts, or maybe even all of those, or a social media account on all of those different platforms, rather. Whatever you decide to do, obviously, it's up to you. However, if you actually want to be fighting against these different companies which are controlling our speech, which are making sure that we are not actually allowed to say certain things, to voice certain opinions, to feel a certain way about whatever we happen to feel a certain way about. The best way to actually fight against that is not to nationalize anything, is not to get the government involved, is not even to repeal Section 230, as much as I think that might have to be repealed. No, the best thing you can do is to use alternative social media platforms. So please, get on Gab, get on Parler, get on Minds, hashtag not spawn, but nonetheless, you should definitely get on those platforms as well. And also, you should go ahead and get on Rumble and BitChute, and on any of those different places, follow your boy. But specifically Rumble and BitChute as it pertains to this channel, because I have a suspicion that the Watchdog will not be allowed on YouTube for long. Politically charged content YouTube does not particularly like, especially coming from a conservative perspective. So if you want to watch this long term, definitely consider subscribing to our Rumble and BitChute account. It's taking forever to upload videos, but we do have yesterday's episode uploading to those right now. So what appears is going to happen is everything's going to end up being a day late on those, at least until I can get some better connection and stuff like that. But we are still uploading all the content up to BitChute and Rumble, so definitely check those out. So that's all the different channel housekeeping, right? Like, share, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Go to the different account places. I don't have any sort of announcements or anything like that. So yeah, I guess that's basically everything we have there. I do see Kevin Blah in the live chat, which means that we are live. So fantastic. Thank you very much for commenting there, brother. I appreciate you. And that means we can jump right into the pre-article discussion, as I like to call it. And what I want to go ahead and talk about today is actually, it may seem a little bit odd at first, but it is something that has been in the news a lot recently. And it is this Nicki Minaj situation, right? And I started bringing up a little bit yesterday how I thought it was interesting how people like Nicki Minaj and others like Bill Maher and Joe Rogan and so on and so forth, who are people who would align with the left, culturally align with the left, politically align with the left in a lot of different ways, are now starting to speak out against different leftist policies. And, of course, this is causing a great deal of uproar, causing them to be attacked by the different cancel culture mobs and so on and so forth. And it's something that I think is particularly interesting for a couple of different reasons. The first one being, as I mentioned yesterday, that it does not only show the circular firing squad that is evil, not just leftism, but evil in general. But also it kind of demonstrates that some of the first people that they go after, because let's be clear, we're not yet in the stage of them seriously going after people, right? I know people like to think that we are, but no siree, believe me, we are not. Some of the first people they actually start going after, right, do end up being a lot of their own people, right? When it comes to this cancel culture kind of a mob, right? It does end up being the previously mentioned Mars and Rogan's and Minaj's, and Lil Wayne's is another one who was chastised for coming out against some of this stuff, particularly the racism narrative. Justin Bieber for coming out against the atheistic kind of narrative, although I don't, there's a lot of things to be said about his Christianity, and that obviously is between him and God. But the point just kind of being, right, the cancel culture mob, the black hole, the vacuum, right, sucks them into the cancel culture just as much as it sucks anyone else in. And in fact, arguably even worse, because really when they try to cancel people who are of the disposition that they won't be canceled or that they're not going to concede to any of these points, well, you're effectively not attacking anybody, right? Like if you try to cancel Tucker Carlson, well, everybody who's watching him doesn't really care what you have to say. But if you're going after somebody like Nicki Minaj, well, a lot of the people who are going to follow her do actually care about what you have to say, right? And I just find that to be incredibly interesting. The other thing that I think is incredibly interesting about it, though, is, as much as people like Minaj and rap artists, right, and all these people, they like to act like they're kings and queens of the universe, right? They like to act like all of their wishes have been fulfilled and they're just living large and on top, right, and all this other kind of stuff. When in reality, even though they likely don't even realize it, they are essentially these objects for our personal pleasure, especially the women, because of the sexual aspect that's added onto it, right? And they essentially dedicate their entire lives to being objectified and being told, dance, monkey, dance. I don't mean that in a racial way. I just mean that in a sense that, they're essentially degraded to these dancing monkeys, right? And then after they have this lifetime of entertaining us and making sure that all of our different desires, whether they're the things that we want to tickle our ears or the things that we want to tickle our other places, and all that other kind of stuff, right? After we've used them for all of that, then we disregard them and dismiss them. And if they decide that they're going to have any sort of an opinion about anything that is off of the plantation, well, not even just disregard and dismiss, but actually actively burn and destroy this quote unquote career that we've actually managed to give them. And I just find that to be certainly, very ironic, because that's just the way that abusers work, isn't it? They use you for what they want to use you for their own personal gain, manipulate you into thinking that it's actually benefit to you, right? That all these things are strength for you or are benefit for you, are luxuries to you, right? All these other kind of things. And then as soon as it starts to go south from their perspective, as soon as you start to realize, hey, maybe you're not actually in control here, maybe you're being taken advantage of in some way, well, sorry, burn that bridge and the entire house that's sitting next to it. And I just find it to be ironic. I think that Nicki Minaj is a perfect example of that. Obviously, the woman is not a conservative, right? That's not what I'm trying to say there by any stretch of the imagination. But it is still something that I find incredibly interesting. It is still something that I think is worthy of discussion. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump out of the pre-article discussions. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk about today, tomorrow. We're going to do 5 days a week this particular week if everything goes according to plan, Lord willing. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump into some of the stuff I want to talk about today, because there is definitely a lot of it, right? So the first thing we want to talk about, we're not going to start with the headliner. First thing we're going to talk about is Republican agenda for the midterm elections. Now, midterms, of course, are coming out. In fact, in a lot of ways, they've already started, in that a lot of people are already announcing their candidacy for certain electoral seats, whether they be representative or governor or mayoral or whatever, right, in different states all across the country. And of course, 2022 is the election cycle I'm talking about, and it is obviously coming up just next year, Lord willing. And obviously, as every election cycle, every 2 years, basically, right, we see people start to get pumped up in this way. It's not obviously going to be as big as the every 4 years we get, right, because that's the presidential election cycle. But nonetheless, governors are being switched out, senators being switched out, representatives being switched out. We are in the election cycle once again. And we're starting to see a little bit of the development of what might be seen as the Republican agenda for the 2022 midterms and potentially, of course, also the 2024 election cycle. The different things that we have seen Republicans try to pass in the different states across the country, Texas, Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, so on, are different restrictions on voting, such as having, and really that's not the right way to word it, to be honest with you, but that is essentially what it is. But it's a little bit, basically they want to establish identifications for the most part, right? Getting it as some kind of an ID card so that you can vote. That's been a big thing. Really, really lenient laws on the Second Amendment. Obviously going hard after Roe v. Wade and trying to criminalize or entirely illegalize in some other way abortion, and a couple other things, of course, that have been popping up across the country, things like banning transgenders from sports and so on and so forth, right? And so we're starting to see a development of what could potentially be the Republican agenda for 2022. One thing that's incredibly interesting about this, even though a lot of these things are very good, right? I agree that we shouldn't have transgender in women's sports. I agree that we shouldn't have, any sort of restrictions on guns. I agree that abortion should be made illegal, all these other sorts of things, right? We do notice that there isn't much being said about COVID restrictions, right? That there are certain political candidates who are starting to speak out against COVID restrictions. There are certainly back and forths in the neocon establishment, amongst the neocon establishment kinds of people, like Brad Little and so on, who I just mentioned him because he's the governor of my own state, right? But for the most part, that's not actually really big on the conservative agenda, right? Or the Republican agenda, I should say. And that's an unfortunate thing, absolutely. Because we are living in a era right now where we could very well see the total destruction of our Constitution, of our political way of life, so to speak. And all over this 99% survival rate of a virus that we have so far decided we're going to shut down the entire world for and demand everybody get the jab for, right? Obviously a bunch of ridiculous stuff. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and share the screen so we can get into the article we're going to talk about for today, where other people have started to notice this forming agenda as well. And of course, we will see that there does appear to be certain things that are lacking in this agenda, as I had said earlier. And that's definitely not something that we like, right? But nonetheless, let's get right into it. I gotta love tea. Anyways, a near total abortion ban, tough voting restrictions, permitless carry, how Texas conservatives could shape the 2022 midterms. And of course, this is just a microcosm of conservatives across the country, but nonetheless, the article is, I think, focusing on a point that is important in my opinion, which is the forming Republican agenda for 2022. And we as conservatives, meaning the ones who the Republicans are obviously trying to speak to, we should be informed as to what that agenda is, right? So this is written by Emma Platoff of the Boston Globe. It's actually September the 12th that this was written. But again, the reason we're doing 5 of these this week is because we are trying to catch up with a lot of the news, right? So I hope you will excuse that it's a somewhat old article. It's still a lot of important information. And obviously I wouldn't have it up if there wasn't. So new limits on how and when voters can cast their ballots. A green light for most adults to carry handguns in public without undergoing training or obtaining a permit, and abortion restrictions that have the potential, to upend Roe v. Wade. In Texas, the red meat is looking rarer than ever, and a bitterly divided nation is taking notice. Now, it is important to note that the conservative agenda has actually never changed. Why do I note that? Because they say a bitterly divided nation is taking notice, as if this is contributing to the bitter divide. And certainly, in a sense, it is. In the same way that somebody like Winston Churchill being unwilling to capitulate to the Nazis certainly created a divide, I would also say that this agenda is creating a divide. But let's be perfectly clear here. The conservatives, at least those who have been truly committed to ideological conservatism, namely Christian conservatism, constitutionalism, and the traditional conservative opinions of people like Edmund Burke and others before us, right? Those of us who have actually been committed to this ideology have for a long time been wanting to criminalize abortion, have for quite some time said all gun laws are an infringement on the Second Amendment, have for a long time wanted to attack taxes, has for a long time said we need to control the voting population to make sure that we don't have any fraud and to make sure that people are actually doing this in an ethical manner, basically, so on and so forth. None of this stuff has changed. The people who have changed are the left. Now, as many have pointed out, like Steven Crowder and others, John Harris is actually another one. I'm getting into him a little bit now. My brother Nicholas has gotten me into him, and he's actually a pretty interesting cat. But nonetheless, as others have pointed out before me, this has actually been the agenda of the left for quite some time, all the way back to, really, we like to date it back to the 60s, but really you can see this start to manifest in the turn of the century, right? Like the early 1900s. It's just that it continues to get worse and worse and worse. And so we keep saying, oh, well, you can, it was this moment when it really started, when in reality, it's the continuation of a political movement that has been around for over a century. And certainly, while these people are right that, there is a element of this always being progressivism. Progressivism, by its nature, starts at one place and moves on to another place, right? Whereas conservatism, by its nature, has been staying in the same place, at least those who are truly committed to ideological conservatism, has been staying in the same place all along, because that's the whole point of conservatism is, hey, we stick our flag in the ground here and we're not budging. The progressive, on the other hand, says, hey, well, we got there, let's go ahead and move on. All right, now we got here, let's go ahead and move on, right? And just as a perfect example of that, you want to talk about something along the lines of COVID restrictions, right? It started off with 15 days to slow the spread. Then it was mask mandates. Now it's vaccine mandates. Now they're, in places like New York and stuff like that, they're actually, replacing nurses with the National Guard, right? And it's only going to escalate until eventually, a lot of places are going to end up like Australia, even in our own country, quite frankly. But we'll talk more about that on Thursday. The point just kind of being that this is a perfect example of the nature of progressivism, right? It starts one place and continues to move on to take more ground once the previous ground has been taken, right? It just happens to be an irony, by the way, that the name is progressivism. It's not like what they mean is, hey, we need to continue to progress down the ledge of our ideas, but it is a great irony that is essentially what they are doing, and they happen to call themselves progressives. Conservatism, on the other hand, it literally is in the name, right? That's the whole point. You stand here, this is the stone wall, we pitch our flag here, we pitch our tent here, we ain't budging, right? And that's, of course, the entire idea. Nonetheless, with a successful 2020 election behind them and conservative challengers targeting them in 2022, top Texas Republicans have leaned right during this year's legislative sessions, passing a bevy of far-reaching conservative priorities. The moves have GOP activists crowing, and other state legislators drafting copycat bills, but they've also caught the eye of the U.S. Department of Justice, which sued this last week over the abortion restriction, as well as national Democratic strategists who argue Texas conservatives' machinations have the potential to backfire for Republicans across the country. And of course, they do. Of course, the lurch to the right absolutely does have the potential to create a reaction in the population that lurches to the left, especially when you consider the fact that the American population and indeed the world population is getting more and more progressive as time goes on. However, that should not be something that dissuades people from fighting from the truth, or fighting for the truth, excuse me. If it was true that Polish Jews in fighting the Nazi soldiers in a guerrilla way, which is the only way they could, would be labeled as terrorists and therefore make it more what's the word there? Make it more make it easy, I guess, make it easier for these people to label the Jews as undesirables or something like that, right? Well, unfortunately, so be it. If they decide to have a harsher reaction against us for being rebels when they're deciding to come after us to kill us, then so be it, right? That's the way it has to be. They're coming after us to kill us. Likewise, in this same situation, right, when we're talking about things like your rights as enshrined in the Constitution, babies' right to live, which of course is the biggest deal that we actually have going on here. All these different kinds of things, right? Integrity of our elections, so on and so forth. When you're talking about these kinds of things, yeah, I'm sorry if you react against this in a way that causes me to be on the wrong side of history, as you like to say it. Fine. I'm willing to take that risk, but there's got to be a line here, right? And frankly, all you do, in my personal opinion, is heap judgment upon yourself like hot coals, to quote a wise king. Some of the conservatives who you're seeing, not just in Texas, but across the country, challenging these people are certainly very, very conservative and very, very radical from the modern American perspective. So there is definitely a lot of reaction you're seeing to that amongst people who would be considered a little bit more establishment. I don't know that Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, has ever been considered establishment, but he certainly is moving farther to the conservative side than he was previously. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, for example, Alan West and Chad Prather, both of which I would totally love to see as governor of Texas, Chad Prather a little bit more so, but they're both fantastic. Nonetheless, both of them are challenging him for governor of Texas in 2022, right? A lot of it has to do with his actions and lack thereof in regards to climate, or not climate, excuse me, COVID. They're basically interchangeable as far as the globalists are concerned at this point, right? But nonetheless, a lot of it is concerned with the crisis at the border, which he doesn't seem to be helping with. Don't get me wrong, the federal government isn't doing him any favors, but nonetheless, he could definitely be doing a lot more. And there's lots of other things you could be listing. I don't want to turn this into a whole thing talking about the Texas gubernatorial election. But the point being that you see that occurring, here in the microcosm in Texas, but also across, in other areas of the country. Like, for example, here in Idaho, we have Ammon Bundy and Janice McGeachin both seeking the Republican Party nomination for governor. Both of them would be considered to be far-right, quote, conservative. I openly support Ammon Bundy and had him on the show. You should check out that interview, actually, by the way. But that is what other people would consider them to be, right? Likewise, you're seeing a lot of support behind people like Rex Rommel, who's a perennial candidate who usually never gets any support at all in Wyoming, right? And this guy whose name fleets me in Nevada, but a former boxer who's also gaining a lot of popularity. Nevada is even a pretty, a relatively liberal place, all things considered. So you are certainly seeing this reaction against mainstream Republicans. Will anything happen? Well, I mean, I don't know. 2010 was supposed to be a reaction against mainstream Republicans, and that ended up being absolutely nothing. The Tea Party movement. So we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, it is true what the article states, that we are seeing pressure from within the party itself to push it more to the conservative edges, which I'm totally okay with, of course. Hang on, let me get a quick drink of my tea here. Orange and spice is literally one of the best flavors of tea you could possibly get. Let me tell you what. Once again, not sponsored, but if y'all want to sponsor me, I don't know what brand of tea this is, but it is bomb. Anyways, the question for national political watchers and for ever optimistic Texas Democrats is whether Republicans, in delivering for their most conservative voters, have alienated everyone else and handed Democrats a winning national strategy in the 2022 midterm elections. Quote, they're so worried about the right in Texas that they're making themselves vulnerable to the center across the country, end quote, said Ian Russell, a national Democratic strategist who has worked on congressional Texas races. Quote, they would be incredibly naive to think what happens in Texas stays in Texas. And I don't think that they do think that, by the way. Back to the quote, the message to voters across the country in 2022, will be some version of, if you vote for Republicans, expect to see what you're seeing in Texas, end quote. But Republicans see the national focus on Texas as fleeting. November 22 is, after all, more than a year away. The midterm election will be less about the policies of anyone's state than it will be a referendum on the Biden administration, argued Brad Todd, a GOP consultant who has worked for the National Republican Congressional Committee. Now, that's true, by the way, not just because this is actually, the case right now, but because this is just a general rule after a new president takes office. There's always a reaction against him in the midterm elections. Typically, whatever his party is ends up losing the majority, right? If they had it at all, definitely losing some of their seats. And so there's nothing really new that Todd is actually communicating to us there, right? That's sort of just the same old story. Now, where I think he's incorrect here is we do definitely see in Texas a microcosm of what the conservatives across America are wanting, with the exception that I don't think that they're doing anything seriously against COVID, though people are certainly against COVID restrictions, I should specify, though there certainly are people who are running for offices, like I said, Chad Prather and Alan West, who are certainly against these COVID restrictions, as well as people who are not holding state positions like Senator Ted Cruz. By state positions, I mean in the state government, right? But this is certainly something that we're going to see spread out to the rest of the country, if not already there. And I really think that it's actually the latter, that it's already there, and that what we see in Texas is, like I said earlier, just a microcosm of us actually being able to see, what the directions of the winds actually are, so to speak, right? But nonetheless, let's continue. Go a little bit further down here. Sorry. The Texas abortion law, quote, is a mirage. We will not be talking about it 6 months from now, end quote, Todd said. Quote, that's going to do nothing but raise money for Democrats and distract reporters, end quote. There's an element of truth to that, but it's not what Todd is actually saying here. The reason the Texas abortion law is a mirage is because there are other abortion laws which are much, much, much more of a big deal that are going to be challenged in the Supreme Court this year. I have already told you guys that we're going to be talking about those different Supreme Court cases, and Lord willing, of course, we will actually be doing that when they occur and when we actually have news to report to you guys. But the fact of the matter is, be not deceived, friends. The reason that the Supreme Court neglected to hear the Texas abortion case is not because they're supportive of the Texas abortion law. They could be. I'm not saying they're not. But it's not the reason that they decided not to hear the case. The reason they decided not to hear the case is because they are already going to be hearing a case which would effectively challenge Roe v. Wade. And I believe it's from Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken, could be Mississippi. But nonetheless, at the time that we're actually talking about that, we'll have the specific details for you. The point being that they're already going to hear that case. It would not be necessary for them to say, hey, let's hear the exact same case, only it'll be, I don't know, like 2 weeks later or something along those lines. Obviously, it'll be longer than that, but you guys get my point. So yes, the Texas abortion law is absolutely a mirage. It is not because it's some kind of a cash grab for Democrats, although, of course, they are going to use it to fundraise. The actual reason is because the battle in the courts has not yet taken place. Everybody thinks that the conservatives have won. They have not. Trust me. That doesn't mean they're not going to. Just means we haven't yet in regards to abortion. The moves by Texas GOP leaders come as communities of color drive the state's population growth, demographic trends that tend to favor Democrats. And specifically the fact that they are Latino. There is seemingly a shift in the African-American community towards conservatism. Donald Trump got more African-Americans to vote for him than any Republican since Richard Nixon. which was 1968 or 72, excuse me, was the last time he ran. But nonetheless, but with the Latino population, which is the population that is growing in the state of Texas, that has not been the case. And for fairly obvious reasons, I think, when it comes to the issue of illegal immigration, that has managed to become a very racialized issue where it is the narrative that if you are against illegal immigration, you are against Latino people. That, of course, is not the case, as evidenced by the fact that many Latino people like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, excuse me, are actually against illegal immigration. But nonetheless, that is the way that that it is painted, right? And so that tends to be where those demographics go. Nonetheless, but the GOP, holding the pen to redraw the state's political districts in a decennial process this fall, has the power to counteract some of those effects with advantageous maps that will stay in place for the next decade. It's no secret that Texas is a red state. No Democrat has won statewide there since the 1990s. But as recent as 2 years ago, there was no appetite at the Capitol in Austin for so-called heartbeat laws banning abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy or permitless carry of handguns. Those measures were filed, but didn't gain traction in the GOP-dominated legislature. Analysis attribute that to the 2018 election, when Democrats made major gains in the state house, even as Beto O'Rourke suffered a narrow loss to Senator Ted Cruz at the top of the ticket. Gave way to a 2019 legislative session focused on kitchen table issues such as public education funding and property tax cuts. Leaders touted bipartisanship and collaboration, the state's loudest conservatives, decried the agenda as purple. And of course, in many ways, it was. The opposite pattern emerged among the Texas legislative cycle this year, with longtime Texas pollster Jim Henson called, quote, a hit parade of conservative causes fulfilled beyond the wildest dreams of most conservative activists, end quote. That's certainly not true. Texas does not go far enough. In fact, there are laws in other states. For example, here in Idaho, you can have permitless carry of a handgun at the age of 18 without any sort of training anywhere, meaning even within the city limits and things like that, right? Outside of places like school zones, obviously, because there's just nothing you can do about that. Texas hasn't gone that far. There are people who have proposed outright criminalization of abortion in Idaho, like Ammon Bundy. Texas isn't going that far. Right. So certainly they're not fulfilling it to even our actual standards, let alone beyond our wildest dreams. But obviously, the Boston Globe is a liberal newspaper, so you're going to get that bias from them. Solid Republican victories in the 2020 elections left state GOP leaders asserting they had a mandate to pursue conservative causes. A new speaker took control of the Texas House, the legislature's more moderate chamber, and was willing to consider measures that had been scuttled in the past. And perhaps most important, analysis say the prospect of primary challengers in 2022 had some Republicans zealously guarding their right flank. Look no further than Republican Governor Greg Abbott, a sometimes inscrutable, and politically cautious former judge and attorney general, who for decades has won his seats and avoided serious primary challenges by stockpiling tens of millions of dollars in his campaign war chest and taking care to alienate few. But his handling of the pandemic has brought constant criticism from those on the left who want him to do more, and those on the right who say he's already done too much to shutter the state, and he definitely has. As Abbott shuns new restrictions, banning government vaccine mandates, and fighting school mask requirements, more than 5,000 Texans died of COVID-19 in a recent 1-month period. And that is the narrative, definitely. Of course, I have my questions about the numbers, but even assuming the numbers were true, it would not justify shutting down the economy. It would not justify forcing people to get vaccines. It would not just justify effectively criminalizing things like providing for your family and going to church and so on and so forth. But we continue. Now, Abbott faces multiple primary challengers, including a former state senator who has promised to shut down the border and a former Florida congressman and Texas GOP chairman who in October led a protest over COVID-19 restrictions on the law of the governor's mansion. I'm not sure who that state senator is, but Chad Prather is the other the Texas GOP chairman they're talking about is Alan West. Chad Prather is the other really conservative person I was aware of, so I'm not sure who they're referring to as by the state senator. Nonetheless, Abbott has had to shift right to defend himself. And this is one of the big things that I want you guys to get from my reading of this article. Abbott has had to shift right to defend himself. Guys, you put the pressure on these people, you start lighting a fire under their tuchuses, guess what? They will respond because they have to. Otherwise, they're going to lose their job. They're going to lose their precious power. They're going to lose all their campaign funding, okay? And as greedy and disgusting as these people are, you can use that to your advantage by saying, hey, you're not going to get my vote unless you buck up and start following my standards, right? And you're seeing that take place amongst different, quote, conservatives who have actually decided they're not going to move forward with the conservative agenda in regards to things like gun rights or abortion, or they are going to capitulate to the liberal agenda in regards to things like COVID and climate and so on and so forth, right? You start to light a fire under these guys, they will be forced to respond. And by the way, you might end up getting them out anyways and replacing them with somebody with much more of a backbone, which should be your ultimate goal there. Abbott has had to shift right to defend himself and potentially to gear up for a 2024 presidential bid, political watchers said. I highly doubt that Abbott is going to run for president in 2024. The dude is not popular right now in his own state. I don't know why he would think it would be intelligent to run for governor of or to run for president rather of the country. Quote, he is somebody who shifts based on political circumstances of the day, end quote, said Luke Macias, a conservative political consultant who is supporting one of Abbott's challengers. Spokespeople for Abbott did not respond to requests for comment. Now, that's really the thing that I wanted to get to, so we're going to go ahead and leave the rest of the article there. I'm going to drop the link in the live chat for you guys so that you can read the articles for yourselves. But nonetheless, I see brothers Kevin Blah, Nicholas, and Kelvy here. Shalom. Thank you very much for being here. If you guys want to read the entire article, there it is for you. Let's go ahead and move on to our next story, which will actually be the headliner. And that is Biden and the Abraham Accords. To remind some of you, the Abraham Accords are the peace deals. It's the colloquial name for the peace deals. It's not their actual official name. But the peace deals signed by Israel and various Arab nations, facilitated by former U.S. President Donald Trump, that basically has been leading us towards more peace in the Middle East, more cooperation in the Middle East, and a potential end in sight to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, the nations that they ended up signing peace deals with were, the United Arab Emirates, I believe Sudan was one of them, if I'm not mistaken. Morocco, I believe, was one of them, if I'm not mistaken. And I think Bahrain was also one of them, if I'm not mistaken. But I know the UAE was certainly one of them. And Saudi Arabia is one who has been talking with Israel very much, although they have not officially signed any sort of a peace deal or any sort of diplomatic relations at all, for that matter. Now, of course, that was part of the Trump agenda. What is President Joe Biden looking to do with not only what he got from the Trump agenda, but also, the pieces that he is getting as we continue to move forward in time? And I have an article here that I want to read you guys that is, I think, very interesting, and basically is asking that same question, and that is Biden, the Abraham Accords, and carrying forward Trump's legacy. From TRT World. This was written September the 16th of this year, and it is Giorgio Cafero. If I said that incorrectly, I apologize. Who is doing the writing here? Let me get another drink here on my tea real quick, and then we'll jump right in. All right. So, probably want to zoom in here. The Biden administration has not only continued Trump's policy in the Middle East, but is trying to expand it. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down again. The Biden administration has not only continued Trump's policy in the Middle East, but is trying to expand it. Now, I don't mean to say I told you so, but that is definitely something that I told you so, right? Where we were talking earlier this year about how President Biden is absolutely going to want to continue forward with the Abraham Accords, with the agenda of making peace between the Israelis and the Arabs. And specifically, I think he's going to want to set up a coalition between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And obviously, we've talked about the Palestinian-Israeli solutions that I think will be implemented. But nonetheless, let's go into the article so that they can actually present their case. President Joe Biden has now been in the Oval Office for almost 8 months. At this point, it is fair to argue that there has been much more continuity from Donald Trump's foreign policy to the current administration's approach to international issues than many observers had previously predicted, and that certainly is the case. The Abraham Accords are a case in point. The diplomatic deals between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel were signed with much fanfare in Washington a year ago this week. I don't know if the Sudan and Morocco ones are just not considered as part of the Abraham Accords, or if I might have got that wrong. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and continue. No, see, I guess, yeah, they're mentioning it right here. Anyways, I must just had a brain fart. Anyways, there in October and December, Sudan and Morocco announced their formalization of relations with Israel. So you see the 4 different Muslim majority, Arab majority nations here that are actually, moving forward with peace under the Abraham Accords with Israel. Anyways, Trump, his supporters, and even many of his political opponents in the U.S. hailed the Abraham Accords as major achievements. The bipartisan consensus in favor of the Abraham Accords has been no surprise to anyone who understands the U.S.-Israel relationship. To be sure, any U.S. administration would welcome any Arab states formalizing diplomatic relations with Israel. When Egypt and Jordan did so in 1979 and 1994, respectively, those breakthrough deals constituted major victories for Washington, which had spent decades, seeking to convince Arab regimes to normalize relations with Israel, irrespective of the status of Palestinians. Any 4 Arab governments formalizing diplomatic relations with Israel through U.S. brokered accords would be a huge historic milestone that any U.S. president would seek to capitalize on, especially if during an election year. Biden, as a presidential hopeful last year, expressed his resolute support for the diplomatic deals, which obviously, right? As president, he and those serving in his administration have stood by the Abraham Accords and backed them up. In the words of U.S. Secretary Antony Blinken, the Abraham Accords represent, quote, an important achievement, one that not only we support, but one we'd like to build on. Yes, one they'd like to build on, end quote. How do they plan on building on it? Obviously, we can only predict, but I imagine it will involve things like normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, normalization of relations between Israel and Jordan, normalization of relations between Israel and all the other different Arab nations, and maybe some of the other non-Arab Muslim majority nations like Indonesia. And of course, it will absolutely have to address the status of Jerusalem, specifically the Old City, and the status of the so-called Palestinian people, right? That will absolutely, positively be on any shadow of a doubt, mark it in your notebooks, something they wish to build into, so to speak, right? Expand into, to put it a different way. They would like very much to see normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They would like very much to see the establishment of a Palestinian state. They would like very much to see the internationalization of the Old City. Those are the points of the agenda that we are interested in, because those are the points of the agenda that are going to be big, and they're the points of the agenda that they would really like to get accomplished, even if that's not the stuff they're going to directly talk to you about in all of the different speeches, news articles, and political agendas posted on their different websites. The current leadership is still implementing the incentives that Trump's administration gave Sudan and Morocco to join the Abraham Accords. In the case of Sudan, that relates to a $700 million aid package and reported plans for organizing an official ceremony to sign the Israel-Sudan Accord, which has yet to be finalized. For Morocco, this is about continuing to recognize Rabat's sovereignty over Western Sahara. Biden's administration not only seeks to improve relations between Israel and the 4 Arab states which normalized relations with Tel Aviv last year, the White House also wants to expand the Abraham Accords. As Blinken explained, the U.S. is currently looking at countries that may want to join in, which, of course, is exactly what we're talking about here. On this front, there could be some differences between Trump and Biden's tactics for pressuring more Arab Muslim countries to normalize their relations with the Jewish state. Trump's team strong-armed Sudan. Last year, the U.S. leveraged the state sponsor of terrorism designation and related sanctions on Khartoum, I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm sorry, to force the Sudanese government to normalize relations with Israel from a position of weakness. Regarding Morocco, the Trump administration was highly transactional, with the U.S. recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara beginning in late 2020. Trump's administration gave officials in Rabat something important that they had wanted from the U.S. and international community ever since the start of the conflict, but never received. But simply, normalizing relations with Israel was something that Morocco's leadership believed was worth doing, given that it was in exchange for Washington embracing a fully pro-Morocco stance on the conflict in Western Sahara, which Moroccans see as an existential issue. It seems like It seems likely that Biden's administration will try to bring more Arab Muslim states into diplomatic accords with Israel, albeit without the tactics and transactional nature of the Trump administration. But whether the White House has any success in expanding the Abraham Accords to include more countries remains to be seen. Now, I definitely want to disagree with the article here when it says they will not be having this transactional sort of thing going on here. Because what I am absolutely positive of is the Biden administration is going to push forward a pro-Palestine agenda and a pro-internationalization of Jerusalem agenda, right? They're also really going to want to see some kind of unity between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Israel and Saudi Arabia thing obviously does not necessarily need to be transactional. Obviously, they're sort of budding their own relationship themselves in order to counteract the influence of Iran, and that could potentially also work to counteract the influence of Turkey. But you can obviously see where the transactional nature of diplomacy will come into play in regards to the Palestinian issue and the Jerusalem issue, right? Because it's one of those things where, hey, you guys get to keep West Jerusalem, give them East Jerusalem. Hey, we're going to recognize Israel's claim over the Golan Heights. Maybe Judea and Samaria goes to Palestine. Hey, we're going to allow the status quo of Jews to be broken on the Temple Mount and even build potentially a third temple, but you need to internationalize the city, right? So you can see certainly how that transactional nature of diplomacy is going to come into play here. The question, of course, remains, am I right? Right? Like, are we right, should I say? Are we in the right to suggest that this is going to be a big part of the Biden administration's agenda? And I see no reason to think that it would not be, considering the fact that the left is very pro-Palestine and considering the fact that the left is very pro-globalism, both of which could seek to benefit very much so from these kinds of transactional dealings with Israel. What Trump's administration could not do, but very much wanted to achieve, was to convince Saudi Arabia to follow the UAE and Bahrain's footsteps and normalize diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. Although, to be fair, Saudi Arabia has been having a lot of secretive talks with Israel, and they are effectively secret pals right now, as we've even reported numerous times here on the show. Now, they're really more co-belligerents. They both don't like Iran, but that's good enough for everybody else, right? Anyway, given Saudi Arabia's religious, geopolitical, and economic influence, a normalization accord between Riyadh and Tel Aviv, it's interesting they say Riyadh and Tel Aviv, not Riyadh and Jerusalem, because they don't recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. But anyways, would constitute a major milestone in terms of Israel's diplomatic integration into the Middle East. For Biden's administration, the announcement of a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be extremely welcome news. Yet, as experts have noted, Saudi Arabia was not ready to take this step under Trump, and it is doubtful that Riyadh would do so under Biden's presidency, unless, of course, Biden is somehow able to guarantee Palestine a state and a capital in Jerusalem. Although Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS, would probably like to see his country join the Abraham Accords, By the way, Mohammed bin Salman is a shisty individual. You watch out for that guy. He is just bad juju. But anyways, the opposition from many members of the Al Saud family and the Saudi citizenry at large will likely incentivize the crown prince to move cautiously when it comes to normalization. That said, the Saudis and Israelis have moved closer together in their informal relationship or tacit partnership. That relationship will probably continue growing, but it will likely grow gradually, with partial steps toward normalization. While the Biden administration is determined to back up the Abraham Accords and possibly expand them, the White House could focus on advancing long-term Israeli security interests by convincing Israel to reach a fair and just deal with the Palestinians. Of course, that's going to come up, right? Because that's the Democrats' main concern. This would do much more to foster lasting peace in the Middle East compared to diplomatic accords between Israel and Arab states that were never at war with the Israelis or even confrontational with their country, which, of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia, that doesn't necessarily apply. But in the case of some of these countries, like, for example, Morocco, that definitely does apply. Nonetheless, here we see, of course, as we predicted, Biden's administration moving forward with the Abraham Accords. And as we predicted, Trump seems to probably have been in on this all along, right? Because this is the global deep state agenda. Sure, on one end, we might have one guy who pays lip service to the pro-life crowd, and on another end, we have somebody who pays lip service to the anti-gun crowd. But what they both have in common is the expansion of globalism and the moving forward of the deep state's Middle East agenda, the moving forward of the deep state's globalist religious agenda, right? Remind you, we still do not have any idea what Donald Trump spoke with Pope Francis about after he met with Saudi Arabia and Israel in the year 2017. You can call me a conspiracy theorist, but I'm sorry, after the last 4 years, I think I have a right to be. And of course, here we see Biden taking the torch and running with it real fast, a lot faster than we would think a 79-year-old man actually could run without just breaking into the bowl of sapient pudding. Can't even make my joke. Semi-sapient pudding that he actually is. And, what more can we say, right? Other than we told you so. We've been warning you about this for quite some time. Trump was absolutely pushing forward the globalist agenda. And by the way, for those of you who believe the Bible, you should have been skeptical about this all along, because we all know as believers that the people who are establishing peace in the Middle East have nefarious agendas, because the Bible tells us so, right? At least if you have any understanding of eschatology the way I do, right? Which the vast majority of Americans would. The vast majority of Christians would, I should clarify, right? But nonetheless, we've all understood Israel is a real big deal when it comes to end times, that the Israeli-Arab conflict is going to be a big deal when it comes to end times, that Islam's status and the Vatican's status is a big deal when it comes to end times, that Jerusalem is a big deal when it comes to end times, that there's going to be a deep state in the end times, that is global in the end times, that is religious in nature in the end times, and Trump is moving forward with that agenda, and yet every single one of you decided, oh, I can't hear you, I'm sorry, because I like the way he makes me feel when he talks about freaking abortion and gun rights, which he did nothing to help, by the way. I'm sorry, but you people need to wake up to this kind of agenda, okay? You need to, because you don't have very much time left. In fact, it might be too late. It might. I don't know. Who knows? Only God knows. It certainly appears like that in some states, right? I don't have any hope for California at all, and I have voiced my opinion numerous times on this channel that I'm totally down with national divorce, or otherwise known as secession, at this point in time, because I frankly don't have any more faith in this country. But obviously, we got to move forward as if there is hope, because what else are we going to do, right? But assuming that there is hope, we do not have long. Open your eyes, please. The neocons, the Trumpists, they are not your friends. I understand those are two different groups, but neither one of them are your friends. Anyways, let's go ahead and continue with our next article. What do we got next? How long have I been going so far? 55 minutes. I'm down to continue farther. I see Jill has joined us today. Rebuke and Reprove. Shalom, thank you very much for being here, my friend. We're going to go ahead and jump to our next couple of things. Real briefly, some updates on Kyle Rittenhouse. So prosecutors will not be able to show Rittenhouse links to Proud Boys, judges say. Again, prosecutors will not be able to show Rittenhouse links to Proud Boys, judges say. Kyle Rittenhouse is set to stand trial beginning November 1st. We will be covering that like an absolute hawk, Lord willing, of course. But nonetheless, prosecutors will not be able to use his, quote, links to Proud Boys. They also will not be able to use some tapes of him earlier in the week talking about shooting protesters on the basis that it was, basically in jest with friends. At least that's my understanding. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump briefly into this article. Emma Colton is the writer of this article. Hang on really quick. I didn't drop the last article in the live chat for you guys. So let me go ahead and do that now. Boom. Anyways, let's get right into this. Oh, shoot. I'm not even logged into my own YouTube right now. Lame. Just a second. Just going to the StreamYard. And boom. I'll fix that problem. Definitely not a problem. Anyways. So, a judge ruled that prosecutors can't argue Kyle Rittenhouse is affiliated with the Proud Boys or that he attacked a woman months before the shootings in Kenosha, Wisconsin last year. Rittenhouse is set to stand trial beginning November the 1st on multiple counts, including homicide. The 18-year-old argues he opened fire in self-defense after men attacked him during a riot following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Prosecutors say that they have infrared video, hang on, I think that's a typo of some kind. Infrared, maybe that's what it is. Infrared video from an FBI surveillance plane that shows Rittenhouse followed and confronted the first man that he shot. And of course, it'd be very interesting to see that because there has been direct video evidence that he was evading both men, running away from both men that he had killed, as well as the third person that he had shot. But nonetheless, it'll be interesting to see that actually presented if they have it. Sorry, I just saw somebody in the live chat saying zoom in. Thank you, Brother Nicholas. Rittenhouse was 17 when he traveled from his home in Antioch, Illinois, about 20 miles to Kenosha on August 25th, 2020, in response to a call on social media to protect businesses there. Rittenhouse then shot Joseph Rosenbaum, Anthony Huber, and Gage Grosskreutz. I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, but nonetheless, killing Rosenbaum and Huber and wounding Grosskreutz, or however you actually say his last name. During a hearing on Friday on several motions, Assistant District Attorney Thomas Binger asked to argue at trial that Rittenhouse subscribes to the far-right group, the Proud Boys, and its philosophies. Binger pointed out, or Binger, however you actually say that, I'm just going to go with Binger, pointed out that Rittenhouse was seen at a bar with members of the group's Wisconsin chapter in January and traveled to Miami days later to meet the group's national president. By the way, real briefly, I just want to say that I am a firm supporter of the Proud Boys. I think that they are actually doing a good thing in going to areas where there is a threat for conservatives to be attacked and defending those conservatives. I understand that violence does beget a little bit more violence, but here's the thing. They're only operating in self-defense. I can do nothing but support them. They're certainly not racist. They're certainly not far right in any way. That is nothing more than a bunch of, frankly, propaganda. And I'm very disappointed to see Fox News actually subscribing to that propaganda too. They don't say alleged far-right group, the Proud Boys. They say subscribes to the far-right group, the Proud Boys. And of course, we've all known for quite some time that Fox is part of the problem, but it's just always disheartening to see. Nonetheless. Binger also asked the judge to allow evidence that Rittenhouse attacked a woman in June 2020 as she was fighting his sister, which of course is obviously understandable. He also wants to show jurors video from 15 days before the shootings in which Rittenhouse said he would like to shoot some men he thought were shoplifting from a pharmacy. Rittenhouse attorney Corey Shirafisi countered that none of the events are relevant to the shootings, which of course is accurate. Nothing shows Rittenhouse was connected to the Proud Boys on the night of the protest or that the shootings were racially motivated, Shirafisi said, pointing out that Rittenhouse and the men he shot were white. Kenosha County Circuit Judge Bruce Schroeder agreed that the defense about the June fight and interactions Rittenhouse had with the Proud Boys, agreed with the defense about the June fight and interactions Rittenhouse had with the Proud Boys. He defended the decision on the pharmacy video, but said he was inclined to, or he deferred a decision on the pharmacy video, but said he was declined to exclude it. So I guess I was actually a little bit wrong there. I thought he actually was going to exclude it. He said that he would like to, but I guess he's not actually decided that yet. So we'll see. It was during discussion about the video that Binger said prosecutors, have infrared surveillance footage that he said follows Rittenhouse chasing Rosenbaum, who was the first person Rittenhouse shot. Rittenhouse attorney Mark Richards maintained it was Rosenbaum who started chasing Rittenhouse, yelling out, "Kill him," which, of course, we have video evidence to document. He said Rosenbaum cornered Rittenhouse in front of a row of cars. Again, we have video evidence to document, in a parking lot and threw a bag at him before trying to grab Rittenhouse's gun. Again, we have footage to document. And everybody's seen it at this point, by the way. Binger said the surveillance footage shows Rittenhouse chasing Rosenbaum with a fire extinguisher before Rosenbaum turned to confront him. Binger said Rosenbaum was probably trying to push the barrel of Rittenhouse's rifle away. After Rittenhouse shot Rosenbaum, people in the streets began chasing him. Video from the night of the protest shows Rittenhouse shot Huber after Huber hit him with a skateboard and tried to grab his gun. Grosskreutz, or however again you say that, then approached Rittenhouse with a gun, and Rittenhouse shot him. Schroeder denied a defense request to argue that Rosenbaum was trying to steal Rittenhouse's rifle because Rosenbaum was a sex offender and couldn't legally possess a firearm. I don't really know how that would have been a relevant defense, but okay. He delayed ruling on defense requests to dismiss a charge that Rittenhouse possessed his gun illegally because he was a minor and to allow testimony from an expert on police use of force. He set another hearing for October the 5th, which is actually only 1 week to the day from today. Rittenhouse has found support from many across the country who have raised $2 million to cover his bail, and former President Donald Trump even suggested last year that Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. Quote, he was trying to get away from them, I guess it looks like, end quote, Trump said during a news conference in August. Quote, I guess he was in very big trouble. He probably would have been killed, end quote, President Trump said. Rittenhouse's mom also slammed President Biden in November over a presidential campaign ad that used Rittenhouse's image to get votes. Hang on really quick. I got to copy this because I'm going to drop it in the live chat. Quote, how dare him, Biden, do that to my son, end quote, Wendy Rittenhouse told host Tucker Carlson in November. Quote, that's my son that he did that to, and I'm not going to back down from him. And Kyle is not a white supremacist. He's not a racist. He is my son, and I know him, and he is none of what Joe Biden said, end quote. And by the way, if anybody wants to say, oh, then why does he hang out with the Proud Boys? Again, the Proud Boys are not a racist organization. In fact, their leader is somebody who is a quarter black and a quarter Latino. So, yeah, that certainly doesn't work at all. Their founder, former leader, is also married to a Native American. So, you know, whatever. They're definitely pretty racist guys, right? So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I also wanted to talk briefly about another thing that was certainly interesting me here, and that is Chinese warships were spotted near U.S. territory. This from South China Morning Post. U.S. Coast Guard spots Chinese warships off coast of Alaska. Pentagon site says an advanced destroyer among 4 vessels seen near the Aleutian Islands last month. Photos of ships taken down from site just hours after they were posted. This is published originally from Lara Zhao, who is actually in Beijing. I don't know how she is managing to post these kinds of things. But nonetheless, it was published on September the 14th, and nobody at all is talking about it. You can actually see the pictures here. There are the Chinese warships, right? I'm not sure what exactly this boat is, like as far as what kind of boat it is, but it's U.S. Coast Guard, right? And you can see the destroyer and 2 other warships. And I'm not sure where the 4th one is, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, you can see it in the picture right here for yourself. 4 Chinese warships, including one of its most advanced destroyers, were spotted sailing in the waters off Alaska late last month as the Chinese Navy steadily expands its range, according to photos posted on a Pentagon Information Service. Yes, that is correct. And you can see the evidence here for yourself. Boom, boom, boom. Anyways, the photos taken by the U.S. Coast Guard showed that 4 Chinese naval vessels, shadowed by 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters in international waters within the U.S. exclusive economic zone in the Aleutian Islands on August 29th and August 30th, according to the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service. They're going to make us want to pay for the rest of that, but obviously, like I said, we wanted to get here shortly, and we have. We will be following this story. The article here simply will end up concluding, just so you guys get an idea of where it does go. I'll drop it in the live chat in case you do actually want to pay for the whole thing. But basically, it says that this is a kind of a nothing burger, even though the Pentagon ended up taking it down. China is expanding its influence into seas that are not traditionally considered its own. South China Sea nonsense, blah, blah, so on. But nonetheless, just wanted to let you guys know about this because Fox News and Daily Wire and Breitbart and even InfoWars and other people like that who are considered to be a little bit more willing to approach conspiratorial topics are not addressing this at all. There are Chinese warships being seen off the coast of Alaska. There are Chinese soldiers who are currently, and not because they're invading there, but because they actually have deals with the Canadian government in Canada. China, friends, has a lot more power than you actually think they do. Nonetheless, that's also something we wanted to go ahead and address real quick. Last thing here, there is actually another article that I want to read. And then we're going to go ahead and call it a night tonight. And that is Lebanon's new prime minister vows to take back land it sees as occupied by Israel. Yes, Lebanon's new prime minister has vowed to take back land that it sees as occupied by Israel. I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the live chat because I forgot to do so. So just a second. Let's go ahead and drop that here. I'm going to go ahead and also just drop the article I'm reading now in the live chat so I don't have to do it later. So go ahead and drop this here. All right. So Najib Mikati, says Lebanese citizens have the right to oppose Israel's occupation and to respond to its attacks. He also demands UNIFIL end Israel's invasions. This is from the Times of Israel, which is the largest, newspaper in the state of Israel. Published September the 20th, so that was about 8 days ago. There's a picture, by the way, of Prime Minister Mikati. Lebanon's new Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, vowed on Monday to reclaim territories it sees as occupied by Israel, while warning that the country has the right to respond to any aggression. Lebanese lawmakers convened on Monday to confirm the country's new government following a power outage and a broken generator that briefly delayed the start of the parliament session. During the session, Mikati said that, quote, Lebanese citizens have the right to oppose Israel's occupation and to respond to its attacks, end quote. Sorry about that. According to Israel's Khan public broadcaster. Makati pledged that his government would continue to work to liberate territories it sees as occupied by Israel, according to the report. The Sheba'ah Farms, known in Hebrew as Mount Dov, is a small patch of land captured by Israel from Syria in 1967. Lebanon maintains that the strip of land is part of Lebanon, despite it having been under Syrian control from the 1950s until it was captured and later annexed as part of the Golan Heights by Israel in 1981. Sorry here. And of course, that annexation of the Golan Heights was actually recently recognized by the Trump administration. As I said earlier in this episode, I firmly believe that will be used as a bargaining chip to get Israel to capitulate on certain things in regards to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank. Neither Israel, Syria, or the United Nations recognized Mount Dov as Lebanese territory. At the same time, Makati said this new government supports UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon. But he added that he would demand it, quote, end Israel's invasion of Lebanese sovereignty, land, sea, and air, end quote. Makati also said that he plans to resume the indirect talks with Israel over their maritime disputes, which the United States is mediating. Now, it's important to note that the reason this is going to end up being such a big deal, the reason we actually have to talk about this as much as we're going to end up talking about it in the future, if it ends up developing into anything greater than this, is because Lebanon is actually friends with Iran. Iran, of course, is friendly with Russia, who is friendly with Turkey and China, and not China being friendly with North Korea. You can see how all of this could potentially get bad. There are tons and tons of situations like that in the world today, where so many different people are allied with so many other different people that a conflict could definitely get out of hand. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean any conflict between Israel and Lebanon will get out of hand, nor does it even mean there's going to be a conflict between Israel and Lebanon. But nonetheless, Makati is actually saying he wants to pursue some kind of a conflict with Israel over the Golan Heights. And who knows, potentially that could even embolden the Biden administration and UN to use the Golan Heights as a bargaining chip to try and get Israel to capitulate to their whims in regards to Palestine and Jerusalem. But nonetheless, we continue. The talks began in October, but stopped a few weeks later and resumed for a final time in May this year. During that break, Lebanon submitted much more aggressive maritime claims. The small Mediterranean country is eager to resolve the border dispute with Israel, paving the way for potential lucrative oil and gas deals as it faces a major financial crisis. Last week, Makati pledged to gain control of one of the world's worst economic meltdowns, saying that he was willing to cooperate with any country, except, of course, for Israel, because can't work with them dastardly Jews. But at any rate, asked during a press conference if he would be willing to cooperate with Syria to address the economic crisis, Makati responded that the government, quote, will deal with anyone for the sake of Lebanon's interest, with the exception of Israel, of course, end quote. Israel and Lebanon do not have diplomatic relations. The Israeli military and Iran-backed Hezbollah, which holds sway over state decision-making in Lebanon and denies Israel's right to exist, fought a devastating war back in 2006, and of course are still sworn enemies to this day. From 1982 to 2000, Israel occupied a strip of southern Lebanon, totaling about 10% of Lebanese territory, in order to defend northern Israel from terrorist attacks. And I personally believe they should have annexed that territory. I personally take a Kahanist position that if any Arab nation is going to attack that lives within the confines of the promised land as given to Abraham, namely land between the Euphrates and Nile rivers, they should have their land annexed. Frankly, I don't think people should play around when it comes to these kinds of things, right? But nonetheless, a new government headed by billionaire businessman Makati was finally formed earlier this year after a 13-month delay, as politicians bickered about government portfolios at a time when the country was sliding deeper into financial chaos and poverty. Lawmakers are set to debate the new government's policy statement before a vote of confidence is held on Monday evening, a vote which Makati's proposed cabinet expects to win with the support from a majority of legislatures. And they actually did end up winning. Makati, who hails from the impoverished northern city of Tripoli, was tasked with forming a new government in July. He was twice prime minister in 2005 and again in 2011 to 2013. and is widely considered to be part of the same political class that brought the country to bankruptcy. The country of 6 million is experiencing its worst ever financial crisis, with a currency that has lost around 90% of its value, people's savings trapped in banks, and qualified labor immigrating in droves, which, of course, would mean that they're looking for somebody to blame, right, as is tradition. The Lebanese pound has slightly increased in value from 18,000 to 14,000 to the dollar on the black market since the new cabinet was announced on Friday, according to the monitoring website lirarate.org, but still lingers far below its official peg of 1,500. Yeah, think about that. 14,000 Lebanese pounds per $1 American dollar. That is insane lack of value for this currency, right? In fact, what they want it to be at is 1,500, which is still insane, right? But nonetheless, that's just the way that we actually have, or that's just the way of the world in regards to the currency we actually have, in Lebanon. Makati became a favorite for the post earlier this year after he was endorsed by most of Lebanon's political parties, including Hezbollah and the other major Shiite party, Amal, led by Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri. Makati also endorsed by former Sunni prime ministers, was also endorsed by former Sunni prime ministers, including former Prime Minister Saad Hariri, who abandoned efforts to form a government earlier this year after failing over 8 months to agree with President Michael Aoun, or however you say that, on the cabinet's makeup. The international community has refused to help Lebanon financially, before wide reforms are implemented to fight widespread corruption and mismanagement. And that is the end of the article there. So certainly something interesting, certainly something to note. There is definitely a lot of problems that are going on in the world. Extreme inflation in Lebanon. Obviously, they already have an incredibly devalued currency in comparison to our own. But even a currency that has worth of 1,500 to R1 being devalued to a point of 14,000 to R1 is experiencing, even in that case where they already have a very poor currency, extreme inflation. In fact, inflation of almost 10 times, right? So that is definitely, that is definitely something to note there. And I think it's going to end up being the catalyst for them trying to find somebody to blame, right? As Oversimplified often says, if you ever find yourself the dictator of a failing country and you need to get out of it quick, there's a tried and true, I can't remember how exactly he says it, but there's a tried and true strategy that has worked for everyone. Blame someone else, right? And so I think that's definitely what we're going to be seeing here. But how exactly will that manifest? Who knows? Will it manifest in armed conflict? It could not. We'll see what happens. Obviously wanted to go ahead and note it. And that's going to be the end of the readings for today. So, by the way, I see Cryptomaria is actually in the live chat. Thank you for being here, Cryptomaria. Appreciate your view. We're actually getting out of here now, so I don't know how long you've been here. But nonetheless, we are going to hop out, and I appreciate your view here. So those of you who want to support this channel, who like this channel, who appreciate this video, please do like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. We will be posting, hopefully, Lord willing, every single weekday this week, and then moving to our regular schedule of 3 days a week, namely Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tomorrow, we're going to be recapping everything that has been going on in the UN General Assembly meeting. On Thursday, we're going to be talking about a bunch of news that has been happening recently, especially talking about a lot of the stuff happening in New York with the National Guard. And we are going to be talking on Friday about a lot of the stuff going on in Australia. So a lot of interesting things to be talking about here today. And I certainly hope you guys are interested in watching. If you guys like this channel, please remember to subscribe to our BitChute and Rumble accounts. Both of those accounts are currently uploading yesterday's video. We'll probably have today's video up tomorrow and yesterday's video up here in just a few moments, Lord willing. But nonetheless, our days on YouTube may end up being numbered because they don't really like conservative political content. So I definitely remember to go to Rumble, go to BitChute, and subscribe to the Synagogue there. Also, if you're interested in helping fight big tech censorship, doesn't matter if you're left-wing, right-wing, not somebody who's interested in politics, but just want to look at YouTube videos of puppies and history and all that other kind of stuff, doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is none of us benefit from the big tech overlords having their power. So if you'd like to fight against that, not only does it help you for you to get a BitChute and a Rumble, because that would be the new YouTube equivalents, right? But also, if you'd like to get a Twitter equivalent, Gab, Parler, Minds, please definitely use those websites. There are also MeWe and Telegram if you are trying to find a Facebook equivalent. You can find your boy on all of those different websites at the Synagogue, and I am also going to be findable on Twitter and Facebook if you'd like to follow me there as well. Lastly but not leastly, if you would like to support us on Patreon, I have the link in the live chat below. If you think it is worth it for me to turn this political punditry into a career, as well as the numerous other things that I am trying to turn into a career, please do consider giving to the Patreon there, only if you feel led and it does not, negatively impact you in any way. And of course, we would certainly appreciate anything that is given there. Number one thing you can do for this video is to watch as much of it as possible. Number one thing you can do for me and my channel is to keep me in your prayers. So I want to go ahead and thank everybody for doing all of that today. And want to go ahead and remind you guys that this has been the Synagogue News. This is the place where we, of course, think like a Neanderthal. I want to remind you all to be watchdogs. And I want to ask you guys the question, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?